Hey, everybody. Welcome to Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity. I'm really excited today because our guest is not only an erudite doctor and pastor, but he's also someone that I would consider a friend, that we've been out for tacos a couple times. We've had great conversations around the lunch table. And I remember both times thinking, man, I wish we were recording this because he's brilliant. So let me introduce Dr. David Harris to you. He's the author of Breakfast with Yeshua, a devotional that I've been working my way through. He's an independent scholar, a theologian, an author, and he's also a former pastor of a Messianic Synagogue. He's a Jewish man as well, but he's had personal experience with the Hebrew roots and the, let's say, the unique problems that they bring to the table. So I'm very excited to have him on. So please welcome my friend, Dr. David Harris.
Hi there.
Hello, sir.
Hi. Good to see you, Professor Rob.
Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. It's wonderful to be here. Great to be here.
So I was thinking about this morning when I was kind of looking through my calendar for today. I first met you at our church here in the Nashville area, but you had come from New Mexico, as I recall it. You came up and introduced yourself.
Well, I grew up in New Mexico, and that's where I worked at the Messianic Jewish congregation there. Somebody at our congregation pointed your videos out to me. So when I realized that we were in your area, I thought, oh, I have to go say hello to this guy. When we had the Hebrew roots controversy, someone took it upon themselves to go searching out Hebrew roots information, and they found your content and sent it to me. Cool. And I said, oh, that's top-notch stuff. Top notch.
That's awesome. If I have your endorsement, I'm feeling good. Okay, before we jump into that, because I would love to talk about that, and we're going to get into that more. And I know our viewers will be really interested in kind of your personal experiences. But before that, for those who don't know about you, share some of your background. What whatever you care to share that kind of informs what we'll be talking about today, and kind of where you come from and what you've been through.
Okay. Well, I was raised in a Jewish home. Kind of mixed family. My parents were both Jewish, but we celebrated Hanukkah and Christmas because my mother brought the Catholic side into our family, and so she went through an Orthodox conversion, and I had 7 years of Hebrew school as a kid till the bar mitzvah, and I finished all of that education with a lot more questions than answers, like a lot of Jewish kids do. And so I just sort of went on my merry way, and eventually I wound up in Los Angeles, and that's where I became a Christian. And when I found Christ, all of those Jewish questions had answers, especially the problem of evil. That had the biggest, because so many Jewish people have left faith entirely, thinking that if there's a good God out there, if there's a God at all, there's no way he would have allowed the Holocaust to happen. And at least half of my Hebrew school training was about the Holocaust, that sort of thing. So when I found Christ, that's when I realized, okay, it's not that God prevents evil. It's not that God explains why, but he's taken responsibility for it through the cross. And that changed my life. That literally changed my life. Yeah. And so from then on, it was just this kind of appetite that all of my Jewish education and the heritage started making some sense, and I started kind of putting it together, and just this appetite for biblical studies and theology, and eventually I went to on, and there you have it. There you have it.
Okay. So when you first kind of came to believe, obviously if your mom had a little Catholic background, the name Jesus wasn't new to you, but what was was it a difficult thing for you to fully accept it, or what were the circumstances of a Jewish kid saying, you know what, I think he is the Messiah?
Well, the thing is, I didn't have any ill will or negative connotations about Christianity or Christians or Jesus at all. I think the first time I ever heard the actual gospel was in the Charlie Brown Christmas special, where Linus,
right,
and Snoopy, or Charlie Brown, it says, what is this about? And Linus just gives him Luke 2. Bam. Other than that, I'd never even heard the gospel, like really. So I had no real animosity or anything against Christians at all. So when I finally became one, it was pretty comfortable. It was a relief. It was a great relief, actually. I guess part of it is that I became a Christian under, I'll just say, kind of a spiritual warfare experience. And one of these old-fashioned conversions where I realized I was a sinner, I personally, and I had a really good friend who was witnessing to me at the time, and so I came to Christ because I realized that I needed forgiveness for sins, but it was His love and His grace that has held me firm all this time.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So another friend of mine who's also a Messianic Jew calls himself a completed Jew, and he said lots of people will be offended by that. What do you think of that term?
I think that's I think you just hit on one of the key points of this entire discussion, which is defining our terms. Like, what do I mean by this word? What do other people mean? And
Right.
I know there are phrases like completed Jew, Messianic Jew. I've been called a Hebrew Christian. I prefer to go by I am a Jewish person and a Christian. I'm not a practitioner of Judaism of any form at all.
Okay.
There are secular Jews. There are Jews who follow Buddhism and whatnot. I like what Spock's dad told him in Star Trek when he said, "You will always be a child of two worlds," and that's just it. I'm Jewish and Christian, both and not having to pick one or the other. And I know that's one of those ways where if you try and straddle the fence, you can get shot down. But I believe it's entirely legitimate to call yourself Jewish and Christian at the same time and not have to, make up any new terms. So I'm not offended by the words, but the vocabulary in this whole realm that's where things get very muddy, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That murky area around those definitions is where a lot of that kind of cult stuff and heresy, whatever you want to call it, that's where a lot of it grows, in those gray areas. And so what you've described seems very similar to me to the book of Acts, although a lot of those first century Jews were still kind of living things out, but what a weird time for them, right? They didn't know they were in the first days of the new covenant, so they wouldn't have even fully realized what was going on. And that's the thing for me today with Hebrew roots. So when we read Acts or we read Galatians or whatever we might read, what we're seeing is people who were trying to work things out, but they didn't have a New Testament yet, right? They were living the New Testament. And so when you fast forward to today and you've got Torahism and Hebrew roots and all this, well, guess what? They've not only got a New Testament now, a body of inspired scripture to help us sort these things out, but they've also got like 2,000 years of processing of what does this mean? And so I'll just put it this way. I have a lot less, I think there's a lot less excuse for trying to adopt some of these Judaizer positions today, especially when it's mostly Gentiles, but we'll get into that. But what I wanted to ask you too is, so educationally, as you became a Christian and as you pursued your education and pursued your faith, walking out your faith, how much of your background do you think came to bear, your Hebrew school and your keeping Hanukkah and understanding, like living those Jewish traditions? How did that impact your view of Jesus once you became a believer?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because if you had told me when I was 11, 12 years old, getting ready for my bar mitzvah, that one day I would become a Hebrew scholar, I would have run screaming away as quickly as possible. Because when I was done with Hebrew school as a kid, I had my bar mitzvah. I never wanted to go back. It was a difficult time. I can talk to you about that a bit, but a lot of Jewish kids go through that kind of thing where you have to memorize Hebrew. It's a lot of liturgy. It's a lot of it you don't understand any of it unless you're really great with Hebrew. But later on, when I went to seminary, it was Hebrew for scholars' use. So it's more slow, careful spade work, like you do in the Greek, and you look at each word, you parse it out and that kind of thing. We didn't really do that as kids. So I was happy to get as far away from it as possible initially. But what I found when I became a Christian is really quickly, the internet was kind of a new thing, and I went online. I just started debating people and everything, telling them all about Jesus. I was on the fire for him. And I had a lot of people coming out of the woodwork saying, well, you had a really poor Jewish education if you became a Christian and a follower of Jesus.
Oh my gosh.
And I just thought, well, okay, 7 years of Hebrew school. All right, who knows what people may think about that, but people lamented the fact that our Hebrew school, or that the Jewish Hebrew school training was subpar. Otherwise, there's no way that you would have become a Christian. Well, at this
Right.
point, they may have said that back then, but after a bachelor's in biblical studies and a master of theology and a PhD now, at this point now, my views are pretty clear, and I'm still very much set that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Jewish Messiah. There's the gospel evidence is there. I'm more of a conservative reader of the Bible, of the text, for sure. I read it as Jewish literature. I don't come at it from a skeptic's perspective, which says, okay, why is this book lying to me? And what's the agenda? I come at it with the perspective that says, okay, this is testimony. I'm going to consider innocence before assuming guilt. I'm going to assume these things are true until I have external reasons to believe that they're not. And so I'm not, that's my approach to it. I'm more of a conservative reader. So for what it's worth.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting. I've heard a whole range, and you can attest to that too. I think we've talked about it at our various lunches, but the experience that ethnically Jewish people who come to faith in Jesus, it's varied across the spectrum. I know everyone's experience isn't the same. You have a very interesting experience though, because you were in, and forgive me, I'm not sure if you were a pastor or what was your role at the Messianic Synagogue?
Well, I took the role of pastor. I didn't use the word rabbi. I took Jesus at his word to say, don't let people call you rabbi. 'Cause words like rabbi or doctor or the titles can separate you from people. I think pastor seems at least more accessible. So I didn't ever want to take the moniker of a rabbi on. It's again goes back to defining terms like that. So I think that Messianic Jewish people in Israel have the same sentiment that a rabbi is just a different category, and I'm not a rabbi. I'm not
Sure.
in order to be a rabbi, you have to follow Judaism in my estimation.
Okay.
So
you were in a position of religious or spiritual leadership of that flock. And so we've talked a little bit about this, but bear with me. How was it that you first became exposed to this movement or this concept of Hebrew roots? Were there folks in your synagogue, in your congregation, that were trying to practice it?
Yeah, they were. And in fact, I was a babe in the woods when I first came across it. So here's one way to approach it is the Hebrew roots and the Messianic Jewish worlds. There's a symbiotic relationship there, almost like I should say parasitic relationship there. And that's probably a better way to put it. And I came into the Messianic Jewish movement.
Actually, hold on one second.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me take your advice, Dr. Harris. Let's define our terms. Can you define Messianic Judaism versus Hebrew roots?
Right. Yeah. Let's set the table. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So if some people consider themselves completed Jews or Messianic Jews, and I consider myself just a Jewish Christian, right? The movement itself, as far as I can trace it, in modern times here in America, began with the Jesus movement, the Jesus, revolution movement, the hippie Jesus movement, and mostly I think in Southern California, where Jews for Jesus, the ministry, came about. So if we start from Jews for Jesus, what happened was that was kind of an outreach movement to the streets, and I came to Christ kind of at the tail end of the Jesus movement. In the early 1990s, and I kind of just went from church to church at that point. I went from charismatic churches to Baptist, whatever, just kind of because I had no denominational affiliation, and that's sort of the thing with a lot of Jewish people. Most of them have no church, connection at all when they become believers, and so I was familiar with Jews for Jesus and a lot of people who'd worked. In fact, they recruited me at one point, and it didn't work out. Turned it down, but they wanted me to work for them. But what happened is that movement over time grew bigger than just Jews for Jesus. And what happened is more and more people did what I did as these Jews, they became educated. They went to divinity school, whatever it may be. They got ordained to different places. And then finally, a lot of these guys decided, what we need to do is start opening congregations. And that's how the Messianic Jewish congregation came about. And with it, all of that vocabulary. Because what you had now is instead of just a bunch of outreach to the streets and hey, come to know the Jesus is, the Jewish Messiah. You had people writing books and starting congregations and doing all kinds of things like that. And so now you've got the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. You have the Messianic Jewish Alliance, these big organizations, and I don't know how many hundreds of congregations all over the country and in other parts of the world as well. So it went from being outreach to becoming more inreach, if that makes sense, because when you get a building and you say, okay, we're going to start doing this whole church thing in a Jewish way, that's when things start getting a bit trickier, because outreach is one thing, but setting up a building, there's one in Jerusalem. It's at the Anglican parish, and it looks very Jewish, and it looks but it's Christian, and people look at it and say, well, I'm not falling for that. Jews look at it and say, oh, it's Christian. They know right away the difference between things that are Jewish and Christian. So a Messianic Jewish congregation is kind of I don't want to say it's just paradoxical, but I want to say it's something that can start a controversy instantly in terms of conversation. You know how people just don't. What's that?
Controversy, but within Jewish circles or Christian?
Jewish people specifically. So people who are Jews who are observant of Judaism. There's even a ministry called Jews for Judaism. Okay, their whole point, is to counter these missionaries, these Christian missionaries, and say that whole congregation over there is a trap. And if you walk into a Messianic Jewish congregation, it's got a Torah, it's going to have all this stuff, but then you go below the surface, and they believe in the Trinity doctrine, and they believe in Christ and the resurrection, and everything that's Christian about it is doctrine. So that's where the real problems, the difficulty, the challenges, I should say, are. So
let me ask you, would you say it's safe to say, as a broad sweeping statement, I know it won't be true everywhere, but that in general, the theology of Messianic Judaism is pretty aligned with the theology of, let's say, Protestant Christianity?
I would say so, and I would say, back to defining the terms, I personally would say let's slow down when we hit the phrase Messianic Judaism, because that's one of the kind of the conflicts, the controversy, the debates among people who are at Messianic Jewish congregations. Because it's one thing to use that phrase to describe a congregation, say this is a Messianic Jewish synagogue, but it's a whole other thing to call it a form of Judaism. And at that point, that's where the real friction is. So, it's friendly discussions, but there are a lot of people who are leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement who subscribe to it as a form of Messianic Judaism. I never did that myself. I don't.
That's an interesting distinction. Yeah, it's not just Jewish flavored Christianity, but it's actually Messianic flavored Judaism.
Yeah,
sort of.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, the Israeli Supreme Court would agree with me on that. That anything you would call Messianic Judaism is actually a form of evangelical Christianity, because the doctrine is Christian. It just has Jewish trappings or Jewish, externals. So
So let me dilute my definition a little more.
Okay.
Would you say that in general, broad brushstroke, we could describe Messianic Judaism, maybe we'll call that lowercase MJ, just kind of generically, as ethnically Jewish people who believe in Jesus? Is that true of kind of as a broad statement?
I would say so, yeah. And I don't want to speak for all of them, but I will say this: that in certain areas, it's less of an issue, I think, because some of these congregations have more, and this goes to the Hebrew roots thing. Where I was at, the congregation had few Jewish people. There were some Jewish people there for sure. It was run by Jewish people, but the overwhelming majority were non-Jews. And I know that there are other congregations where they're packed with Jewish people, and so it's easier in a larger group to say this is Messianic Judaism when there are, the strength in the numbers, I guess. I personally, for me, it's a theological thing. So I just make a distinction. This is Christianity, this is Judaism. But when you have fewer Jews in those congregations, that's where the Hebrew roots tend to come in, and they did with us, and they want to just sort of, get involved and sort of run everything and take it over.
So if we take the same sort of broad brushstroke definition over to Hebrew roots, would you say that Hebrew roots definition, generally speaking, is well, my personal opinion is it's 100% Gentile. I can't guarantee that scientifically, but it's a movement of people, regardless of their ethnic makeup, who teach that Christians, so followers of Jesus, whatever you want to call them, are obligated to keep what we might call the old covenant rituals. I realize there's lots of terminology in that, but you get what I'm saying? Is that general description accurate in your opinion?
I think that's pretty much the case. Yes, I think that's
okay.
I think what you have
So
is
now you're at a Messianic Jewish synagogue that billed itself as Messianic Jewish, right?
Yes. And I was not the founder. As I said, I happened to trip on in there one day, and they saw my resume and said, "Oh, look at this. Let's hire him." And it worked out. It worked out for a dozen years.
Sure.
It was wonderful. And that congregation is still going very well. But there's a fundamental philosophical difference between the way I see these things and the way that a lot of the Messianic Jewish people in ministry do see them. So
Sure,
it does come down to definitions. The phrase Judaism.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, actually. But so now I'm curious. If you're in your role at that Messianic Jewish synagogue, and a Hebrew roots movement somehow begins to boil up, what is it that's telling you the difference, the theological differences, that's alerting you to the fact that there's some false teaching going on the Hebrew root side?
Well, that's the experience that I had. See, the leadership who hired me on, they recognized the dangers of the Hebrew roots movement. So they at least understood that there is something out there. These are older, more experienced people than I was at the time, and they knew what was out there in terms of the Hebrew roots movement. I thought these are just Christians who love Jews. Yay, good to have them here. And they're wearing yarmulkes if they want to. Fine, they're wearing the prayer shawls and they know the Shema, and wonderful for them. I had no clue that that underneath all that was a whole doctrinal bent. And so at first I was just happy to have more folks. I thought, that's wonderful. Our congregation's growing, right? But what happens is eventually it starts to break through in terms of issues of salvation by grace alone, sola gratia. And you have people suggesting, well, it's a good thing that we're keeping the feasts here and all this stuff, and Shabbat really is on Saturday, and you can only observe it on Saturdays, right? Never mind the fact that Saturday is the Saturn, and every day of the week is named some pagan thing. They see paganism lurking in every corner of society. So if you celebrate Christmas, then that's pagan. And so they have this whole agenda that starts to come out when, they're very militant about Hanukkah, they're very anti-Christmas, but at the same time, most of them come from Christian homes. So they have pastors as parents, and they went to Christian schools, a lot of them, and this kind of thing. And what happened is they, somewhere along the line, started reading the Old Testament, and then someone maybe on the internet got into their heads, and they came to the conclusion that oh my gosh, I'm the first person who's ever read this, and nobody understands the law like I do, and so therefore we need to keep the law. And they're off and running, they're off to the races. So then they show up at a Messianic Jewish congregation, and they think, I'm home. And then when they hear the rabbi or the teacher sounding more like a Christian, like I was, they think we got to fix him.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. So there's always that, and I think we may have talked about it when Dr. Michael Brown was on my show, and he kind of did this sequence of fascination and stimulation and all that, right? So he talks about this arc of interest that suddenly turns into something kind of sinister after a while, or it wanders off the ranch into heretical territory. Have you seen some of that where maybe it starts with a very legitimate interest? Because we all need to know our Old Testament better, let's be honest, right?
Right, we do, and it's undertaught. And that's actually my specialty, was teaching the undertaught books. So when I go through Leviticus, they loved it, right? but when I went through Hebrews, Galatians, it was like match in the gas tank, like riots, right? You think, okay, but back to what you said, when Dr. Brown was on your program, that was exactly right. He had it. It was what fascinate the Hebrews, the whole thing in their mind. They get fascinated with it, and then it starts to stimulate their understanding because it's something I haven't read. It's 2/3 of my Bible, but then it gets complicated. So there's a complicate level, and suddenly I have all these new rules, and then it starts to suffocate the faith because no longer are you saved by grace. And I think you added in that you added legislate. So it's like, and that is what fascinate, stimulate, complicate, suffocate, and then legislate, and you've killed it. And that is what happens. So
yeah.
Yeah,
it's sad to see that because
it is.
I'm down the fascinate and stimulate part myself. I love that, and I have the Hebrew roots to thank for opening up my eyes to the Old Testament and for getting me really falling in love with the Tanakh and Hebrew and those sorts of things. I wouldn't be where I am had I not been, I guess, however I want to say it. I usually like to say I stumbled through the back of the wardrobe into this other world of Hebrew roots that I didn't even know was around. And so the good side of that, and maybe that's the corrective they're playing in the broad church, is reminding us where we came from, right? Reminding us of those Hebrew roots, literal Hebrew roots of the faith, the Jewish roots of the faith, because no one can deny. Jesus said, salvation is from the Jews, John 4. So we don't want to deny any of that, but where it becomes difficult is finding those nuances to remain biblical. Right? You don't swing the pendulum either way. So how are you handling this when you're in a position of authority and you've got this kind of stirring going on amongst your synagogue?
Well, it was hard, and I appreciate what you're saying because there's you want to have sympathy for people who are wanting to get closer to God. And I can understand people looking at their Old Testament saying, how come nobody ever teaches this? How come nobody goes verse by verse through Deuteronomy? They just don't, right? And so you want to care about these folks, but at a certain point, what happens is once they become militant and they get the prayer shawl on and they start telling everybody, okay, they start legislating. It gets difficult. So for me, it was kind of this, again, as I said, slow sort of awakening to this whole thing. One of the things that happened with me was I had the opportunity to translate for the TLV Bible, the Tree of Life version. And so I translated Leviticus and Exodus. And when I taught out of Leviticus, it was very well received because, again, people don't teach out of it, right? And so I was translating it for that Bible version and also teaching it at the same time. And people loved it. Later on, when we went over to, Hebrews, Galatians, they wanted to hang me as someone who had desecrated the Torah. And so here's the
If I could ask you a little bit, what specifically, when they were coming and complaining to you, what were they complaining about? I don't understand.
One of the main things, somebody sat me down to try and get me to disavow the idea of an eternal hell. This was a Seventh-day Adventist thing. So yes, there was that one, that in particular. And then others really wanted me to say, no, you must keep the feasts and you must keep Shabbat on Saturday and you must disavow Christmas and this whole sort of thing. So,
they were finding all the New Testament scriptures that supported what you were teaching, they were pushing against?
Yes. Well, I mean, they find like the one where Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Not one jot or tittle will pass away until all is fulfilled, right? And you know how they do this. They take all these passages and tie themselves into pretzel knots, trying to make the case that, yes, we do have to keep the feasts. We do have to keep kosher. We have to, the dietary laws. And don't say we don't have to, but we don't have to. And if you've been around Judaism long enough at all, you know that you can lay so much on top of what it is just to keep Sabbath. I mean, everything from turning off the light in your refrigerator so that you don't, start electricity on Sabbath to washing your hands. There's so many rules and regulations. It's crazy. And so these people, they came out to very militant against me. And I was the one who gave them the translation they were using of the TLV Bible. So that was the irony of the whole thing. That
is ironic.
Yeah, you couldn't win. And so here's the one, so on one hand, I translated the TLV. On the other hand, I've desecrated the Torah in their eyes, because I'm teaching the least of these, the nullification of the law, basically, is what they would accuse me of.
Right.
Putting
on your pastoral hat for a second, when you look out and think of some of the folks that you dealt with, do you have any personal opinions or thoughts about what maybe drives that? Do you think it's a spiritual issue? Do you think it's an identity issue? What do you think causes people to kind of stumble into that movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I want to have sympathy for the people who are just wanting to know the Hebrew scriptures better, because those people they're prey for these other folks. But I think that there is an identity thing there, and we're living in a time when people are kind of identity obsessed right now. And whereas, if the Messianic Jewish movement started back with Jews for Jesus and the Jesus Revolution era, I would suggest that the Hebrew roots movement goes all the way back to the British Israelites in England.
Sure. And
you have different people who concluded that they are part of the lost tribes. There's the British. There's the idea that the word British actually is Berit Ish, covenant of man.
I've heard that. That's so funny.
Or that Saxons. The Saxons are Isaac's sons, right? So
you have to give them credit for their creativity,
right? Just these flimsy word associations. It's completely unscientific, but somehow you get this, and again, people want to live an adventure and all this stuff, I appreciate that people want to get closer to Narnia. They want to get closer to the Bible. They want to get closer to King David and Jerusalem. But all that manufactured stuff is that's just a bunch of lies, quite frankly. Yeah. And it's unfortunate. It
is, and I think maybe there is something in the makeup of folks, because I've said this before, and I don't mean any offense, but I'm just saying what I see. There seems to be a tendency in those who, let's say, have gone deep down the rabbit hole into Torahism, into Hebrew roots. They seem to be the types of folks who tend toward conspiracy theories. There's a surprising number of Hebrew roots folks who are flat earthers and other strange things that it doesn't make sense, right?
Wow.
And a lot of times their Hebrew rootism, their Torahism, will lead them to look at the Old Testament passages about the earth on the pillars and whatever and take it literally. And I don't even understand how you get there. But one of the problems I have, and I'm curious if you experience this in your synagogue, is I hear from the people who are affected by it, not necessarily the Hebrew roots person, but my son or my wife or my grandkids or whatever are getting into this, and they're telling me all this stuff. And the first thing they'll do when they come to me is say, how can I respond to this argument? They're down at the argument level, right? And so, I kind of talk, you need to take a step back. We need to kind of figure out what's going on. But there is a interrelational problem that it causes, that angst. And that, to me, that's the bad fruit of bad teachings that would cause that kind of division among families and, like you've experienced, churches. But how do you see the other side? How do you see people being affected by it? Did you have people in your church or your synagogue that were pushing back, or how did that play out?
Well, for us, it was a real division, right? Again, as I said, when I started teaching Galatians, and this is my naivete stretched all the way through, because we had gone through Deuteronomy for over a year. I mean, just verse by verse, over a year. And I thought, well, they're gonna want a switch, a break. Let's do something New Testament. We'll go to Paul. Haven't been to Paul in a long time. They'll love it. Everybody loves the Bible, right? And there's a quote out of Galatians, draws from Deuteronomy. So I made this natural connection, and I thought, wonderful, they'll love it. I had no idea. No, they don't. They don't love it at all. They hated it, and people walked out angry and everything. And so I honestly thought, how could you not love Paul in Galatians? And this group does start to put together a dislike for all things Greek, all things Hellenistic, and Paul is a real problem, right?
Yep.
And so the
Yep.
relationships, I mean, my family and I were united and everything. But what happened in the congregation was the people who were really hardcore Torahism, as you call it, or Hebrew roots, they got up and marched out. And the people who knew their theology better, quite frankly, the more mature Christians were able to say, no, we're not moving. And if you need to go, you need to go. So it actually galvanized the congregation quite a bit. There were the more solid Christians who were more mature in their faith were able to look at it and say, yeah, there you go. You're trying to get me to become a law keeper, and you don't even understand. We're saved by grace alone, literally saved by grace alone. And it's not even this issue where they try and say that, but if you keep the law, you'll get a little bit better of a salvation. They don't understand the concept that, no, you do not keep the law. You break it all the time in your heart, constantly, more than you know, more than you ever want to admit. That's the reality that they just, underneath it all, that they just don't understand.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. And that's the thing that's so difficult, because for some people you can see the spirit of legalism start taking over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even while they're protesting that this isn't legalism, this is how I'm showing my love,
Yeah.
And it's very, I see a lot of spiritual warfare in there, a lot of deception from the enemy and veils over eyes and things like that. The good news is that I've seen and heard from people who've reached out, who've come out of Hebrew roots. Some of them will reach out. You'll see sometimes in the comments on the videos on our YouTube channel, people talking about, man, I believe this for years and thank you. And, they just kind of got sucked in and didn't even realize where they were. So I always keep that in the back of my mind, because I don't want to, number one, I'm nowhere near the Apostle Paul, so I'm not going to even pretend to play at the game at the level he does, so to speak. But how he'll be really harsh against false teachers. I always draw back from that and try to kind of follow what Peter said, treat people with gentleness and respect while you're defending your faith, because I don't know what's in their heart. And I don't know if they're this flat out demonic false teacher, or if they're Mr. Confused for a year or two, And so what would your recommendation be when talking with people that are into this, that are trying to convince you? Like, how would you recommend responding?
Well, it's a great question, Rob. And I'll say what I've found is that it seems like this movement has been kind of growing underneath the surface of a lot of churches, and a lot of pastors don't know what they're looking at. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know. They haven't really heard of it, before. And because there's no one particular leader, there's a whole bunch of them out there that people have to kind of deal with them one at a time. But what it seems to me that is going on is a lot of them at the root of what they're trying to do is they're trying to live a better life of some sort and gain the benefits of being in God's will by following his law to the best of their abilities. Now, I want to say this, that like in terms of personal holiness, if the issue is, look, I just want to observe Sukkot and I want to have the Jewish holidays, and Paul said one man considers one day sacred and another man considers them all the same, and each should be completely convinced in his own mind. I think that's important. Yep. That's very important. Like my wedding anniversary is more important to me than it is to other people. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. So everybody has to have their different days. But if someone wants to, for the sake of personal holiness, come alongside Jewish people, God love them. And if they, or for the sake of personal holiness, if they want to wear a yarmulke, or if they want to have a Passover, I'm all for that, because personal holiness that's a matter of just personal devotion to God. So and that's why it should include anything that's not, sin. So
right, that's Romans 14 as well. Yeah, he talks about
yeah. So observing Christmas and all this stuff, unless it becomes idolatry, which anything can become an idol. I mean, you can worship a Christmas tree, you can worship the Torah, we're called to worship God. So all these things for personal holiness, I think, are acceptable and good. But what I found though is when it starts to become this agenda where we need to follow the law And if we follow the law, we're getting a better salvation than you people over there. What's going on there a lot of times is they're trying to have a better life in such a way that they don't think that they would get if they didn't follow the law, right? Because they're thinking, well, if I keep Sabbath, then I'll be blessed. I mean, it says, in the Torah that if you follow my ways and keep my commands, then your crops will be abundant and all this stuff. But the thing is, what I think they're doing is they're taking that and thinking, well, I'll be successful if I do this stuff. It's not just the simple base level that, you won't starve. So in fact, I would even suggest that what you remember back in the, I'm dating myself, the 80s and the 90s, the whole prosperity gospel, right?
Oh, yeah.
You name it, claim it, word faith kind of thing. If I speak it and manifest it, I'm going to get rich, right? I think what's happening is the Hebrew roots movement is sort of filling the vacuum, since the word is out on the street about word faith movement and that it's bunk. That people are saying, well, how? But if I keep Torah, now I'll have prosperity doctrine. And that's what I think.
That's interesting.
That lures a lot of people in there. They think, you know what? Okay, this name it, claim it thing didn't work, but I'll bet you the Jewish holidays will. That'll work. If I direct, right?
They're trying to get extra blessings in their lives or things like that.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that before. That's an interesting theory. I can see some overlap there for sure.
It's sad. I think it's sad. That's where I think a lot of people get their hearts broken. Just like the word of faith movement too. Like, well, God didn't promise us, prosperity.
He promised us struggles, really. Yeah. In this world, you will have trials and tribulations, Jesus said.
We just will. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Jewish Gentile thing. So I've heard from different folks, and I'm always super curious about this just at a personal level. I've heard from some Jewish folks, and meaning Judaism, not Jewish Christians, but they're very offended by Gentiles keeping any Torah traditions at all, much less the prayer shawls and the tzitzit and all that stuff. But even if they want to do, they don't even want them, keeping the Shabbat or something. They get kind of offended, like cultural appropriation. Others I've seen are more generous about that and say, no, come in, learn what we're doing. This is great. They'll invite them over for Passover or whatever. So as a Jewish Christian, your two worlds that you're in, how do you see or how do you view Gentiles sort of adopting what we might call Jewish customs or Torah customs?
I don't have a problem with it as long as it's respectful. Because how many non-Jewish people would love to be invited to a Passover and wonder what it's like. You have, again, the whole Bible, and 2/3 of it is hardly taught. It's alluded to in church sometimes. How many of those people would like to actually know, okay, what was Jesus's culture like? I mean, what was it really like? And that's why I think people love to go to Israel and everything. But yeah, it is a discussion more among Jewish people whether because on the one hand, if you have these Hebrew rooters now coming along saying, okay, you got to keep Torah, we got to keep Torah, we're keeping Torah, we're the Torah-keepers, in fact, they call themselves. And then you have Jewish people saying, oh, no, we're the Torah-keepers, we have the obligation, you don't have an obligation, we do. All right, I set all that aside. Here's another pop culture reference. That book by Dr. Seuss, the SNEETCHES? Go look for all your viewers, read the SNEETCHES, and you'll get the Hebrew roots versus the Messianic argument over who gets to keep the law, right? We have the stars on our bellies. We're the ones who should keep the law. No. So
stars on theirs.
Yeah. So I don't subscribe to any of it. I don't think I subscribe to the idea that we are sinners, that we are saved by grace alone, that our every most of our lives are just confirmation that we are sinners. A lot of our lives is that we sin, but that we're saved by grace and grace alone, and that we break the law so regularly and so consistently. And that's not to say that we shouldn't, trust the Lord to help us to grow in morality and ethics. But the real rub is, okay, at what point does the 10 Commandments from Sinai have standing above the whole temple tabernacle system. And that's where it starts to get, that's where, the conspiracy theorists and everything and the politics and all come in there. I personally think that we are absolutely done. God is done with the temple and tabernacle system in terms of this world. It's done. And I think Hebrews makes that abundantly clear. And our relationship is changed to that whole thing because of Christ. Because of Christ.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because the temple is a big thing. There's a lot of talk about eschatology, the temple being rebuilt. They'll look at things like Ezekiel 14 and Isaiah, basically the last 20 chapters of Isaiah, and talk about how in the end times, look, what's going to happen. The nations are going to go up to Jerusalem and celebrate the Feast of Booths, and everyone's going to be eating kosher and all this stuff. What's your thoughts on that eschatological angle about all that stuff coming back in the end times?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that the best passage that I can send people to is in Matthew 17, when the temple authorities come and they ask Peter, "Hey, does your teacher pay the temple tax?" And he says, "Oh yeah." And then he goes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "So, do the children of royalty pay taxes, or are they exempt from paying taxes?" Right, basically. And he says, "Well, no, the children of royalty don't pay taxes." And Jesus says, "That's right. But just so that we don't make them upset, go and catch a fish." And remember this, there's a coin in the fish's mouth, right? He goes and he catches a fifth, and it's the 2 drachma tax for paying the temple tax. But the whole point is the children are exempt. That's the key right there. The children are exempt. And I think that it's subtle, but the point is, if you're a follower of Christ, if you're in the kingdom with Jesus, if you're one of his disciples, one of his followers, you are not obligated to pay into the entire tabernacle system and support it, which is overturning of everything that would have kept the thing running. The whole thing, all of it. So whatever may happen eschatologically, whatever may happen in terms of Israel and the future and Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, even still, our whole relationship is changed with the tabernacle system. If the new Jerusalem apparently will be paradise, and I'm all for it. I'm happy to have it come down today. But I think the thing about the Hebrew roots right now is you have people taking it to a whole other level because of what's happening now in Israel. And with the tension out there and all the protests and everything that you see going on, I think you've got a lot of people who maybe are having second thoughts about walking around wearing their Jewish garb and showing, look at me, Hebrew roots. Yeah, that's so.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I actually it occurred to me that Matthew 17 parable, there's a different perspective that you could take away from it as well. Jesus saying, look, you don't need to pay that, but so that there's not trouble, which is very reminiscent of everything the Apostle Paul says, is to not cause your brother to stumble, right? And you're going back to Romans 14, he talks about, hey, there's weak in faith. He calls them the weak in faith that are too scared and they only eat vegetables. But Paul says, don't lord it over them. Don't judge them about it, right? So the point isn't forcing other people to do things your way. Unity is a really big factor in the kingdom. And so this is another area where if it was a Hebrew roots guy that had to pay the temple tax, he would have been on a soapbox, legislating that everyone has to do this and, and causing all sort of disruption and disunity over those sorts of issues. So I think it's an interesting angle that the fruits of, and this is, again, broad brushstroke stuff. I know a couple of fairly reasonable Hebrew roots folks. So I don't want to paint everybody with this brushstroke, but there's a lot of divisiveness that comes out of it, a lot of causing your brother to stumble, literally, in what do I do with my faith now? I had someone reach out to me the other day that said, man, I've been out of Hebrew roots 2 years, but I have to admit, I still feel too guilty to eat pork or whatever it was. I forgot the food that he said. I still have that sense of guilt that's inside of me about that, and on one hand, you'd want to say, you don't need to feel guilty, and which is what I said, but at the same time, follow your conscience. There's nothing wrong with avoiding pork if you want.
No.
Right?
No.
But the fact that it all got stirred up inside this guy and that there was a stumbling spiritually in their walk rather than encouraging folks. That's really disappointing to see that. I think that's kind of evidence of that this is not of God.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking, that whole thing. And the division between people who consider themselves pronomian versus and everybody else is antinomian. Well, Jesus wasn't
Right.
against the law. Jesus wasn't against
Right.
the law at all. And there is a lot of richness there. There's a lot of beauty there. There's a lot of important things there. There's a lot of morality there. I think it's important. Everybody should get a good lesson in Torah and understand it,
Yeah.
and everybody should get it. And I think that's part of what a lot of what is happening in Hebrew roots movements is that they're going, okay, I really want to learn because I'm in a hotel and I found the Gideon's Bible now, and I'm going to look at the Old Testament and actually read it. And
Right.
they see it and they go, oh, right, but you've gotten it backwards because you're reading it after you've been raised with years of being a Christian and in your local church. And now you're realizing, well, this whole thing's Jewish, right? And so I don't blame those people for getting, lured into that. But again, Jewish people have been Jewish a long, long time. And there's a reason why. There are lots of reasons for, looking at these things and saying, okay, are we going to do this today? Would we do this today? Would we not do this today? And Jesus does give us, I think, clarity that
Right. Yeah.
salvation.
And that's the nuance I was talking about before, where it's like, we're not saying throw out the Torah, not at all.
Yeah.
We need to study the Torah. We study, like I was reading, I forgot the name of the book, but the author was making a great point. He was saying that Christians should approach the Torah and the laws and commands in the Torah. We should approach the laws given at Sinai with the same sort of intuition that we approach the commands that God gave to Noah. We don't read those commands thinking they apply to us, but we do read them with the understanding that there's truth there, there's value there, there's things for us to learn there. And so even the laws given at Sinai, the moral laws, of course, have predate Sinai and they'll never end as far as, loving God and avoiding murder and all this kind of other stuff. But even the stuff at Sinai that doesn't apply to us, right? Like, I'm not a Levitical high priest, so I would never exercise or execute the Yom Kippur sacrifice. It would be sinful for me to obey that command because I'm not a high priest and I'm not from the tribe of Levi. But when I study that, I learn so much, not just about how God did it back then in the ancient Near East, but what does that say about Jesus? And all those, you mentioned Leviticus, right? You go through all of Leviticus and you see these beautiful pictures of the purity and the setting apart and the holiness and all that, and the offerings and the sacrifices. There's so much richness for us to still learn, even though a lot of those commands don't directly apply to us today.
Right. And the thing is not to learn it in a vacuum, because that's what a lot of people do. They'll pick it up and go, okay.
Great point.
And they think, again, I'm reading this and nobody else has ever read this to me, so I must be the first person who's ever read it, right? And that's where a lot of the problems come from, But like I said, I was fortunate to be able to specialize in teaching kind of the undertaught books. So Leviticus and the really weird, hard, we call them weird, but the hard passage is like, when a man, for example, has suspicion against his wife that she's been cheating on him. And the whole thing is, well, they go to the high priest and they're supposed to write down on a scroll the charges and then, pour some water on there. She's supposed to drink it. And the whole thing is in front of the priest, if her whole intestinal, reproductive system doesn't fall out, then she's innocent, right? That she hasn't been cheating. So, okay, you take that kind of thing and are we going to do that? We're not going to do that. We're simply not going to do it. Now, the point is, okay, is there an explanation for that? Well, there may be. Okay, if God is supernaturally going to expose someone who's committed adultery, then biblically, if you're a supernaturalist, that could actually happen. At the same time, people say, well, wait a minute, how come there's no recourse for the woman who thinks that her husband is cheating, right? This is the feminist scholarship would say, instantly look right at that and say, why is it that there's no right for the man. Well, at the very least, you have a situation where the woman can be brought before the high priest and say, okay, fine, give me the drink it up, and say, there, see, there you go. Now back off. Right? So at least you have that, like you did in front of the priest, the whole thing. So all that kind of stuff, that's important stuff to read, but it's also not only is it interesting and it's important for us to understand, but it's also stuff that's time bound to the ancient past, because we're simply not going to do that. I don't know any Hebrew rootser. I defy a Hebrew rootser or anybody to say, okay, yep, nope, we're going to take you to a priest. I'm going to make you drink this, ashes and this mixture. And see if you've been. It's just not what we do. But in that time, it spoke to that culture. It spoke to where they were. So, yeah.
We forget about how Israel was called out of the pagan nations around them, right?
Yes.
I mean, Abraham's father was probably a polytheist, right? So Abraham gets called, and God takes these people out of the world and sets them apart. So this is the world they're in, that he's trying to create these rules and guidance to show him, no, this isn't the way we do things.
Yeah.
Here's how you're different than those folks around you. And so some of those strike us as awfully bizarre, but you're right. Once you start learning them in their historical setting, they suddenly start to seem beautiful and ingenious that God would set up those sorts of rules. But you brought up a really good topic. So the concept of picking up, and you mentioned the 10 commandments or whatever, that commandment about possibly cheating, right? Picking those things up, kind of rooting them out of the context in which they were given, not just the historical context, but the covenantal context. And then trying to apply it exactly the same under the new covenant, that leads to all kinds of silliness and mistakes and misapplied commandments and things like that. How do you see the Jewish Gentile divide in terms of the old and new covenants and us being under a new covenant? And, a lot of folks would argue for continuity between the two covenants. And others would say, well, there certainly are matters of discontinuity between the two covenants, right? How we atone for sin is quite different. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how it affects the theology of Hebrew roots, kind of the covenantal approach or the aspect?
Yeah, I think the big elephant in the room that nobody ever talks about when they start bashing Christmas and going Hebrew rootsy is circumcision. I think that's the big C. No one wants to talk about that because, okay, let's say you're born into a Gentile house and you're not. A lot of people are circumcised just because culturally, for whatever reason. And I should say, my understanding is that in certain countries, in certain African countries, in order to reduce the spread of AIDS and these sorts of STDs, people have said, maybe circumcision would help to sanctify what's below the belt, right? Is the idea to sanctify your sexuality, right?
Right.
Well, okay. If that was the sign of the covenant, then if you're going to go Hebrew roots, should you not? If you have not already been circumcised, get that procedure done, even as an adult. Now, I don't know. I'm sure there are Hebrew rootsers who've decided to take it that far. But again,
sure.
Yeah. But again, I'm gonna suggest, just like you said, it's something that came. It was time bound to the ancient past. In that, when God had Abram go get circumcised, he never had to say, "Oh, what's that? What do you mean circumcised?" He knew exactly what it was because it was something that was done in the culture, in the surround. People knew. The pagan culture, they knew what circumcision was. So it's one of those topics, and here we are talking about it. But
we're all adults here. It's okay.
Yeah, we're all adults here. But if people are going to look at the Old Covenant and say, okay, there's no distinction at all between what they were obligated to do back then and what we are obligated to do right now, then circumcision should be the first thing a Hebrew rooter ought to do. It's the first thing.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, should be really, almost militant for it, because that's.
Of course, they'll have to ignore, Galatians 5 and all the other.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 7. If you were circumcised.
Right, and of course, and what they say, And they'll say that, of course, that the New Testament was tainted by Hellenistic Greek philosophy, and so we're going to throw away Galatians 5 and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, which I always, it's very common. It's scary how common it is for someone to say, either marginalize or completely reject the Apostle Paul.
Yeah,
that's he's the the stumbling block for Hebrew roots, so to speak. And my response is always, well, look, if you want to only believe the parts of the Bible that you like and reject the other parts, well, then it's not the Bible you believe, it's yourself. And then you're in a whole other world. And that's paraphrased from Augustine, I believe. But it's a very true comment. It's suddenly, oh, I'm in charge and I'm going to do some editing here, because clearly some stuff slipped through. But me today in 2024, I figured it out. And I'm going to go ahead and edit the Holy Scripture.
Yeah.
That's a lot of hubris there, if you ask me.
What I did is I encouraged people to learn Greek. I taught Greek at the Messianic Synagogue that I was at. I wanted people to learn Hebrew and Greek, not just Hebrew. That's the thing. When you get to a situation where, okay, we start redefining words, and Christianity is no longer Christianity. It's now Messianic Judaism or a Messianic something or other. And
right.
I'm no longer following Christianity, and we're more Hebrew. We're pro-Hebrew. We're anti-Christmas and anti-Greek, and it's a both and thing. Rob, you know it is. We all know it's a both and. It's Christian. They go together. They go together very, very well.
Yep, absolutely. I agree. Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to give folks a chance to learn a little bit more about you, what you've got. I mentioned this before, the lovely Breakfast with Yeshua devotional book. I noticed that you've got beatgoliath.com. Is that a good website for you?
That is my personal website. People should go there and check it out. I was
just checking it out today. I was impressed by your PhD dissertation on what was it on? Remind me.
It's on Holy War. It's called Holy War Discourse.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Book of John, right?
Yeah, it's actually Book of Revelation and the War Scroll, and so it's
cool.
Yeah, that's a new thing. I'm real happy about that. Excited about that. So check that out.
That's awesome. Yeah. So beat Goliath, as in what David did.
Yes. Beat. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, that's great. So anything else? Anything else you want folks to know about how they can maybe reach out to you or read what you're doing or get involved with what you're doing?
That's about it. That's go to beatgoliath.com and sign up for the newsletter, or I don't think I have my email on there, but for now that's about all I've got. So
okay, beautiful. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Man, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure as well. Thanks, Rob.